Okay, we are live. Good evening, everyone from China, and good afternoon if you're in the UK. Good morning if you're somewhere else, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to another of my takes on China today with Professor Hussein Akari. Is that right, Professor? Is that all right to call you that?
I'm not really a professor. Some people call me professor. I sometimes give lectures, some universities. That's fine,
Yeah.
but I'm not a
Okay.
professor formally.
And renowned author, but also I have a discussion point here. You're a fellow of the Guangdong Institute for International Strategies, which I just found out today. That surprised me because I live in Guangdong. So
Oh,
it's great to have you on the show. Thank you for coming in. You are
thank
an
you very much.
expert on the Belt and Road, and you've written a book. We're going to come to that in a little while. But first of all, I wanted to get your view on what the Americans are calling China Week in the Senate. They've had proposals for 28 different, basically anti-China bills. What's it all about and why?
Well, some people say because it is the election season in the United States, so everybody's competing to be more warlike and more antagonistic to both China and Russia and Iran and everybody else, and to show how hawkish and powerful they are. But this is a process which has been going on for a while. Remember, in the 2021 Strategic Competition Act, we had similar items on the agenda, including enormous financing of $300 million per year for 5 years to smear China and the Belt and Road Initiative in the media, not only in the West, but also in the developing countries in Asia, Africa, and elsewhere. So this is not new, but the background to all this, and I think that's why the world today is very, very dangerous, is that we have had a paradigm shift in the world. And these things, like President Xi always says, changes that have not taken place in 100 years. And you better listen to it. Because when you have, like we say, tectonic shift, when earthquakes take place, they say that the plates of Earth, the tectonic plates, they move one upward and one downward. And in that friction, you will have the massive earthquakes and tsunamis and all these things. This is what is going on in the world. We have a plate which is going up, which is China's rise with Southeast Asia, including India, the global South generally, and also Russia, and the decline of the Western powers, economically, physically, culturally, financially, scientifically, and I'm talking about this because I have lived in Europe in the West for more than 30 years. So I know from inside, as an activist, how this decline has taken place. So it's in this context that the West, which believe that we have arrived at the end of history, that they will be the dominant powers, and that the rest of the world, including China, they will produce our T-shirts and shoes and refrigerators and all these things, and they will stay down there producing things for our globalized international market. And they will, we will pat them on the shoulder and the back and say, oh, well done, thank you for all the consumer goods we have on our shelves. But you never will think that you can be something or challenge us, So now the shock has come to the West is that not only China is not buying that setting, China is rising and bringing with it all Southeast Asia and now Africa to say, oh, we are industrializing, we are modernizing, we are no longer producing T-shirts and shoes for you. We are modern industrial nations. We want to have a high living standards like you. We want to have scientific, cultural, and development in every aspect. We have space programs. We have programs to colonize the moon and Mars, So it's that shock which got people in the United States and now in the EU scrambling to find a way how to stop it. Now, the stupid thing is to stop it. The important thing is how to manage it and go along with it and create a world order which is beneficial for everyone. We still have enormous technological potential, scientific potential in Sweden, in Europe, and in the United States, that we can use that and contribute with that to the development of China, Asia, Africa, and the whole world. It is just this idea of superiority which has just been crushed by China and other nations in the global south and the BRICS nations, that this idea of supremacy, superiority is gone.
Mm.
And that is what's creating the enormous tension and this hawkish, warlike tendency to want to crush everybody around you.
So
and that's dangerous.
This 1.6 billion that's just been signed off, I mean, it hasn't been signed into law as yet, but it's been signed off by the Senate, I think. That is superseding, or is it replacing, or is it adding to the 500 and the 300 million that already exist in these bills from a few years ago? And can I, before we go one step further, can I also tell the audience, it's not a very big audience yet, but can I tell them who it was who pointed this out to the world?
Oh, well, well, in 2021, I did an interview with CGTN, the Chinese television network, with Mrs. Li Jingjing, and she wanted to ask me about my research on the debt trap, and which I have done a lot of work since 2017, 2018. On debunking the debt trap narrative. But in the context of that, what I found at the time is that in the U.S. Congress, there was this Strategic Competition Act of 2021. There was 3-4 items. It's called the Fund to Encounter Malign Chinese Influence. It was already there, and they said that this fund will be financed per year, $300 million per year for 5 years, which makes it $1.5 billion, renewed, I think, every year, to encounter using that money to finance mass media generally, bloggers, civil society activists, all kinds of independent people in developing countries, mostly through the U.S. State Department and through American embassies. So American embassies will disperse this money to people who are prone to be against their governments, especially governments who are actively cooperating with China on the Belt and Road, like Zimbabwe and others, that they will train young people, journalists and activists and bloggers to write things and make videos and do like even demonstrations against China's involvement with their own countries. There was one big scandal, as you mentioned, I was the first one to actually internationally talk about this. And at that same period, there was a big scandal in Zimbabwe where the U.S. Embassy was organizing courses for young activists and bloggers and some journalists to how to write bad things about China's projects in Zimbabwe and do other actions. And one of the participants in one of these courses, he came out actually publicly, and this was published in the Zimbabwean official newspaper. He said every member was offered $1,000 for each article or video they produce. And $1,000, that's a lot of money in Zimbabwe.
Yes.
So a lot of people in Africa, so they would say, will jump on that money, say, just, you want me to write an article of bad things about China? I can write an article, no problem. So that was the essence of it. But the funny thing is that this is not working. The view of China and the Belt and Road in the developing sector in the global south has improved enormously. And there was a survey recently conducted in 13 countries in the Belt and Road nations in Asia, Africa, Latin America mostly. And the people who were questioned were very, very positive and open to cooperation with China and the Belt. So all this money is just a waste of time. I advised at the time through that interview that if the United States builds 30 hospitals each year for that money, $300 million, modern hospitals in Africa, that would win the minds and hearts of the African people more than pouring money into smearing, writing bad things about China. So they didn't listen to my advice, and we don't have those hospitals. We would have had 150 modern hospitals in Africa with an American flag on them. That would be great propaganda for the United States.
Yeah, it didn't have to be just hospitals. It could be schools, colleges. And, the thing is, if they were to influence schools, influence education, they could get a far greater bang for their buck, I think, if they were to try and influence education. So let's move on now to Africa. In a recent article, I saw you mention that Africa is like a big tree where the fruits fall on the wrong side of the fence. I thought that was a wonderful analogy. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yes, and also putting it in context, I was very happy that article was published on the front page of China Daily on the opening day of the China-Africa Summit 2 weeks ago. So it was very interesting. No, what I meant by that is that, like Africa during the colonization period, Europeans were looting African resources, natural resources and other resources, but also human resources, enslaving Africans, taking them up to the Americas and using them as, for producing crops and other things. So the fruit of Africa was being exploited somewhere else. In the post-colonial period, we had a short period of relative, when African nations were becoming, liberating themselves, also with the help of China and also the Soviet Union, you had a shift in that policy. Many of the colonial powers kept the strings to the colonies with now the special agreements, like the French agreement with 7 African countries for their currency, dependency and financial dependency on France. Many of the mining interests remained there. In the British colonies, we had new agreements, many nations. I wrote a long article on Zambia and the debt problem in Zambia, which was used as a model. I mean, if you remember last year, Janet Yellen, the finance secretary or the treasury secretary of the United States, the IMF chairman, the Mrs. Kamala Harris, they all went to Zambia because they wanted to use Zambia because it is in a deep financial crisis, to use Zambia as a model to stop China-Africa cooperation. But I looked at the background. What I discovered is that Zambia, before the 90s, it was more of a socialist-leaning country, which had nationalized the raw materials, which the British were controlling. But in the 90s, there was a shift after the collapse of the Soviet Union. China was not so powerful yet. So there was a shift in Zambia towards more market economy. And the United States and Britain and the Europeans went back to Zambia, and to support Zambia's development, they imposed new regulations through the IMF and the World Bank, which meant the privatization of Zambia's copper and other mineral mines. And now 7 British companies, international companies, control most of the copper production in Zambia. And they pay 0 taxes to Zambia. And the profit is not repatriated to Zambia. So the copper is taken away from Zambia, and Zambia gets around 6% of all the wealth, which is extracted from its land. So this is a perfect example. We also have the immigration of the young people from Africa. This is also fruit falling into Europe and it's not only, like people coming from the countryside. We have educated people who are, their governments, their countries, their families spend a lot of money on their education, but they end up serving in Europe and the United States and other parts of the world. We also have financial resources leaving the African continent in capital flight, like around $800 to $900 billion each year leave Africa because of corruption. It takes 2 to tango. I don't say that it's only the fault of the West, but it's the fault of Africans and also Arabs, like in my own country, that the situation is like this. But that is shifting now. It's changing. And the fruit, which is falling from the tree of Africa, should now fall into the lap of the African people themselves.
Well, I've got 2 anecdotes that I can add to this. One is that just a couple of weeks ago, I was at a welcome party. I've done some training for a language a company. You can't call them a school. They're not a school. You can't call them a language center. They're not that. And they're something of an agency. And they've got over 70 Africans working for them here in Zhongshan, which is a small city. 70 Africans have come there. So when you're talking about the fruit falling, these are all highly educated people. Some have masters, some have PhDs. All of them have at least a bachelor degree and some experience to come here, and they're all working in the education industry. And I think this is a great thing. So that's one aspect where China and Africa are linking, because if it's happening in Zhongshan, it's happening in other places. Zhongshan's a very small city. The other anecdote, I have a very good friend who lives in Australia, but travels a lot to Zambia. And a while ago, he was in Zambia sending me video images of one Chinese company after another. Chinese company, Chinese company, Chinese company, Chinese haulage trucks driving along a road that was built by China, across bridges that were built by China. So even if Britain is still stealing or expropriating the wealth of their copper, China is still doing a lot of work with Zambia. So this is, in my opinion, quite a good thing.
True.
So
yeah, Chinese companies are also big in the mining sector in Africa, in Zambia. I list one of the Chinese companies as the 8th company extracting copper and other minerals. But the Chinese policy is to industrialize, build infrastructure, so the people in Zambia, the government in Zambia, can have industries incorporating copper, not basically exporting the raw copper.
Yeah. Actually, China's been trying to do this in Australia too. They're literally bringing shiploads of Australian dirt to China, and they would much rather bring Australian steel. But Australia won't invest in the infrastructure for the steel.
Right.
Moving on to the next question. You've described previous investment projects as treating symptoms of poverty. And I believe that goes back to the colonial days as well, where they would treat the symptoms rather than fix the causes of it. Why is it that Africa is still so impoverished when it probably is one of the richest resourced continents or regions in the world? How has that happened?
Yeah.
Or how has it been allowed to happen, I should say? Sorry.
Yes. There are two things. One is actually related to the idea of wealth. What is wealth? And I always quarrel with my African friends who say, oh, we don't need anybody else. We have all the resources we need in Africa. That's not true. Wealth is not natural wealth.
Yeah.
That's important as a prerequisite. What is important is the ability to use that wealth. When President Xi Jinping was in the Johannesburg 2015, he in the FOCAC summit, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, he said that Africa is absolutely positioned as the most promising region in the world to leverage its advantages and achieve industrialization. But he said there are 3 bottlenecks of development which have to be resolved. And these are things we have experienced as a developing nations: the lack of capital, the lack of infrastructure, and the lack of skilled labor. So it's not enough to have natural resources. You need technology, you need infrastructure, you need skilled labor to achieve development and modernization. Yeah. The other reason is for Africa remaining poor is because in the post-colonial period, which is new colonial period, you still had the exploitation of the natural resources, where Africa was exporting raw materials very cheap, but importing finished goods very expensive. One very simple example is Nigeria, until 2 weeks ago, didn't have oil refineries. Nigeria, is one of the largest oil exporters in Africa, could not refine their own oil. I know this also from Iraq, because you sell oil for $100 a barrel, let's say, but you import fuel for your cars, for your factories, for your power plants. You import plastics, you import paint, which is produced by industrial nations for 10 times, 20 times, 30 times the original price of the oil. So Africa was throwing away its natural resources. And that goes to copper, it goes to aluminum, it goes to everything. That's one reason that Africa never managed to benefit from its resources. Number two, Africa was put into food dependency. Can you imagine that Africa, which could be the breadbasket of the whole world, African nations import 80% of the staple food they consume? That's wheat, rice, maize. Amazing, isn't it?
Yes.
Egypt in the 60s was self-sufficient in wheat production after the revolution and decolonization, and they focused on agricultural reform.
Mm-hmm.
But when the peace process Kissinger initiated, they told the Egyptians, the new president Anwar Sadat, that they don't really need to put so much energy and technology in producing wheat and rice. They will get it for free from the United States as a gift for the peace with Israel. They can focus their agricultural land on producing cash crops, vegetables and fruit to export to Europe to get the cash. So many African nations, and when we have plantations for tea, coffee, everything, they produce cash crops to export to Europe and other places where it's turned like cacao and cocoa and coffee is then changed into chocolate, which is worth 10 times more the bean. So they kept doing the same thing with the minerals, with the food stuff, exporting cash crops, but importing very expensive and sometimes life-threatening, because like we had recently, most the wheat and fertilizer comes from Ukraine and Russia. When the war breaks out, every African nation is going hungry.
Yeah.
So that dependency means that, like in Egypt's case, they had to borrow. When the United States stopped giving them wheat for free, they had to borrow dollar to buy wheat from Australia, from Ukraine, from Russia. That put them in a debt trap, together with the problem with exporting raw materials and importing expensive. So African nations were put in a debt trap, for many, many years, but mostly after the oil crisis in the 1970s, which forced African nations to borrow heavily, and also Latin American countries, to buy oil, which is denominated in dollar. Then we had these currency shocks, the IMF and the World Bank coming in and advising African countries how to solve their problems. So the first thing they start with is to devalue the currency. So overnight, you have to pay twice in your natural resources to pay the same amount of dollar you have in debt to the West. So this has been a perpetual process. And then, of course, we have these other funny aid programs, which, run into the sand and bring no benefit to the African nations. It just makes the donors feel good.
We'll come back to the aid and those sorts of things, but I wanted to ask about those three bottlenecks. Is there any evidence that they are being challenged? I know that China is attempting to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, but is there evidence that those three bottlenecks are being challenged?
Yes, I mean the whole Chinese effort in Africa. I remember in 2014. This is one of the reasons I was inspired to write this book with my colleagues in the Schiller Institute, Extending the New Silk Road to West Asia and Africa, which was a follow-up to this other report you put on your YouTube channel. This we produced in the Schiller Institute after China announced the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a 400-page with a blueprint for development in the whole world, which we had started in the 90s. We have other books I don't have here, to integrate the continents of the world. So this is a fantastic policy. The Chinese premier in 2014, Li Keqiang, he visited 4 African countries. And at the end of the trip, he was in Kenya, and he met with the East African leaders. And he said that China was willing to connect all African countries with high-speed rail or modern railway network. Mm-hmm. So in 2014, then they immediately signed an agreement with Kenya, with Ethiopia, and Nigeria. And Mombasa to Nairobi railway was built in 3 years in record time. The Djibouti to Addis Ababa railway, 700 kilometers, was built also in 3 years in record time. Just amazing. Now, this is part of an African plan to integrate all the African countries with transport networks. They call it the Pan-African, Trans-Africa Highway Network, which connects, it's like three north-south corridors, Alexandria, Cape Town, Algeria, and the West Africa going from North to South Africa. Mm-hmm. And then we have 4 going from East to West Africa. And China was, started launching this. Now, one of the important things in Africa, this is a real bottleneck, and it shows you how terrible the condition is. When the colonialists built railways in Africa, the railway was different nations had different gauges. Okay? But the railway goes from a mine to a port, or from a plantation to a port. It has nothing to do with the population. So in between the African nations, especially the landlocked countries, out of the African countries, 54, 17 countries are landlocked. Those countries suffer the most because they can't reach the international markets. So therefore, the trade between African nations among themselves is only 13% of all Africa's trade with the world. Okay. So African nations prefer to trade with Asia, with Europe, with America, rather than trade with other African nations, although the same goods they might find in Africa, but there are no transport networks connecting them. So the World Bank study in 2006, which we cite in the book, says, although they never built these projects, but the study is interesting. It said, if we only upgrade the road network in sub-Saharan Africa, trade between African countries will increase by 500 to 1,000%.
Wow.
So this is what the Chinese were pointing at. And the Chinese are doing their best. I mean, look, Africa is 3 times larger than China. Okay, this is a huge continent. China alone cannot do these things. China is providing a great model for cooperation, but more is needed. These projects have transformed Ethiopia and now even in Kenya, but the extension from Kenya to Uganda, to Rwanda, Burundi. I really appreciated watching your interview with our friend from Uganda, Mr. Mubarak. Very, very eye-opening. I know many of the projects he described in Uganda. I've been looking at them, but I really recommend that people watch that interview. Very, very fascinating examples he brings. But this will be like a game changer for Africa, because there are many goods in Africa which African nations need, but they have to import from outside the continent for much higher prices. And also the lack of transport is like in this book, I looked at how much a container cost to transport a container from Singapore to Mombasa, which is on the sea. It cost at the time $4,000. But the same container to bring to Kampala in Uganda would cost $8,000, double, because it will have to put on a truck, and the truck will go on muddy roads, and if there's rain, the road is blocked. So it costs enormously to transport goods in Africa. So this is one of the bottlenecks China is trying to deal with, and it's doing all kinds of projects, railways, highways. Like there are 100,000 kilometers of highways, 10,000 kilometers of railways China built, but much, much more is needed. And in terms of the lack of capital, China has provided, like officially, is like in the first FOCAC 3 years in 2015, $60 billion. That's the lack of capital bottleneck. And then in 2018, 60 billion. This year, President Xi Jinping pledged 50 billion. But also there are investments by Chinese corporations, like in industrial parks and so on. These are very huge investments. They are not really official support, but Chinese banks support Chinese companies who want to have business in Africa, which is very important as a policy, which Europe and the United States should do, but we are not doing that. Then the third bottleneck of the lack of skilled labor, China has emerged after President Xi Jinping's speech. it actually surpassed both the UK, Britain, and the United States in the number of students studying in its universities. So previously, people would send their kids to Britain, the United States. Only France is still ahead of China because of its connections, historical, cultural connections to Africa. But more and more Africans, more and more Africans are getting scholarships to travel to China. China has lots of training programs, the Luban workshops, but also vocational training projects, agricultural training projects in Africa, and also healthcare and other projects. So China is actually playing a role in all these three bottlenecks, but Africa needs much, much more than that.
So effectively, if America and China could cooperate, this would be a game changer for the impoverished of the world, wouldn't it?
Yes, also Europe, but it will be a game changer for the United States and European economies, because our economies are dying. We need new markets. We need better markets. It's like, I was saying in another interview with a guy, it's like China's policy is to make its customers richer.
or at least a little bit less poor.
Yeah, exactly. So, in what we did in North Africa, like in Libya, killing your customer, like the Libyan leader, is not a good marketing policy.
No.
So you destroy your economic partners by these incredibly reckless policies and criminal policies. So it is an enormous, this is one of the reasons we started the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden, because we want Sweden to join China in Asia and Africa and elsewhere, and even here. We need infrastructure projects. But we can put together the enormous potentials we have, each on his side, to develop. We have actually 3-4 joint European, African, Chinese projects, including connecting the continents. We can build a tunnel between Spain and Morocco for high-speed rail from Italy, Sicily to Tunisia.
Wow!
I have an engineer from Italy who helped us also in this. Of course, we have from Istanbul to the Asian to the European side. We have tunnels and bridges. We need to build more of such projects. So, as I was telling some people in a conference, like with Africans should come to Europe on high-speed trains, not on these rubber boats.
The funny thing is that China has actually got a plan to go to Australia. I mean, it's a tentative plan, of course, with high-speed rail. And, when you think about the first leg of that is already in place. It goes from Kunming to Vientiane. That is going to expand through Malaysia. It's going to go through Thailand. Vietnam is going to have a line. There's no reason why it couldn't come all the way through Indonesia. Now, whether it'll ever go to Australia, that's a different story. Because Australia,
we actually have
a little like you mentioned before, where you talked about the different railway gauges. New South Wales and Queensland have different railway gauges, or they used to have. I think they've changed it now, but it was only quite recent. They two different states built different railway gauges. So if you caught a train from Brisbane to Sydney, you'd have to get off one train and get on, or you'd have to have a change of accommodation on the way down. Amazing stories when you see that happening. So after FOCAC this year, do you think there was? I mean, we can go back to the previous 3 FOCAC meetings, the South African meeting, and then there was another one in China as well. We can go back to those meetings, and they all came out positive. Do you think this one was positive in the same way, or were there any differences between this as the relationship develops? Is it changing?
Yes, this one was very extraordinary, not only in its organizing, but also in its outcomes and the whole context, because the 2 key words was used is modernization and industrialization, something I have been fighting with my colleagues for a long time. The other thing is that actually China's commitment to the African nation was strengthened, not reduced, as some people were claiming, that there will be less investments, it's difficult. It's not true. China not only elevated its relationship with the African nations, nations, to a strategic level, comprehensive strategic level, but also it's going to increase its input in Africa. But this time it's qualitatively different, because we talk about high quality modernization in Africa, This is using modern technology, higher technology. And the leaders of Africa, we saw this actually already in the Third Belt and Road Forum last year.
Yeah.
African leaders, African nations now, they say, we don't want aid. We don't want, the old stuff. We want modern industry. We want to have, like Zimbabwe, they banned the export of lithium, raw lithium. They say, we want to build battery factories in Zimbabwe. You want to do that? You are welcome. You don't want to, you don't get our lithium. This is the general sense in Africa, is that the raw materials in Africa should be manufactured in Africa, not finished goods maybe, but semi-finished goods, and gradually go to finished goods. Yeah. So there's an industrial process that the added value, which I described before, Africa exporting cheap raw materials, importing expensive materials, this is gone. This is, African nations are not going to accept that. The other thing is that the African leaders, almost all African leaders went to China this time. They went there a few days ahead of the summit.
I saw that, yeah.
And they visited Chinese cities to see the enormous change that has taken place and the enormous modernity, the industrial development, technological development, but at the same time, the beautiful environment and the preservation of culture. Right. So it's like China wanted to showcase the fact that, as President Xi said in 2015, Africa is completely capable of modernization and industrialization using its resources. But the Chinese say, look, the president of Zimbabwe in an interview, he said, I was in China 60 years ago because he was a soldier fighting against colonial, the Rhodesian regime, and China was supporting. So he was trained in China. He said, I was here 60 years ago. I was here 40 years ago. I was here 20 years ago. And you can see the change.
Yes.
And that was very important for African leaders to see. They take the high-speed train, because usually African leaders and politicians, they come in the evening, they go sleep, they go to the meeting next day, and they have to go back home. Yeah. So it makes a whole difference when you see the results of China's development. It's not just a rhetorical thing. It's not something you see on the news, but it's something you can touch and feel yourself. And then you say, I want like this for my people.
Yeah. So you can easily go to London or New York and see all of that development in place. But when you come to China and you came here 20, 30 years ago and came back again, you actually see it actually taking place. Because 30 years ago, I came here 20 years ago. It's a very different place.
Right.
What about the 33 countries that got the tariff-free trade agreements? It's not quite a free trade agreement, but it was tariff-free. All their exports to China now are tariff-free.
It's a gift. It's a gift from China to those, very poor countries, the least developed countries. These are countries who are in deep problems, and they have certain products that need marketing, need development, and export them. And China is saying, look, we have a huge market, we have a huge appetite. The Chinese people have an enormous appetite now, and everybody around the world should, if they want to start a business, the Chinese market is huge, and the Chinese have fantastic appetite now for products. So those nations are given a gift to increase their income and also develop their agricultural goods. It's mostly agricultural goods. China and Africa, those African nations, they cannot export industrial goods to China. But it's mostly agricultural goods. But what happens in the meantime is that China is helping those countries develop their agricultural industry, right? Both increasing the production, but also the packaging, this processing, and building the infrastructure, the refrigeration, and so on, to make the export of these goods possible at a higher quality. So this is very, very important. It's like, but it's connected to the other issues, China's other. Because both in the last summit and this summit, President Xi focused very much on agriculture. Because African nations not only can export, but they have to fill this gap in food security, sovereignty, which is bleeding their resources. We saw this with both the Corona crisis and the Ukraine crisis. African nations could not get hold of bread to feed the people. Wow. So if Africa does not solve the food problem, so they can produce their own food, this will remain a major security threat to African nations, but also a financial problem. So China is actually enormous education programs in the agricultural field. Many of the African students studying in China, they are studying in agricultural engineering. And part of the program, which I saw a report recently, actually part of the program that those African students should go back to Africa, to their country, and implement an agricultural program as part of their education.
Yes.
Utilizing...
That's exactly how it works in a Chinese university. And I've spent a lot of time in rural China. I'm very lucky in some respects because I've traveled through, but I've also been asked to go with other organizations and look into this and talk to people. So Guangdong Television, for example, might invite me to go and have a chat with the National People's Congress delegate in Qingyuan, which is where I was last week. Qingyuan is a city in Guangdong, but it's a relatively poor city. It's in north, it's got mountains, or part of it is mountainous, and very, very poor. And it was the whole city was very poor until quite recently. Now the main part of the city, quite rich, but the rural areas are still quite poor. And I met with people there who were from university doing a 1-year training. They've come from their university and they're being supervised. And this is all done with all kinds of technologies, but they're being supervised by someone in an agricultural college in Guangzhou. And they're working with a lab in Guangzhou in a field in Qingyuan. And they're doing this all around China. I was in Guizhou recently doing almost exactly the same thing. I was talking to a doctor in Guizhou, in a Guizhou hospital, who says, "Oh, I'm not qualified to do operations, so they do them using 5G on this equipment." And he showed me some equipment where a doctor in Guangzhou is operating on somebody's eye, taking out the eye and fixing it and putting it back. I mean, it's quite horrific to watch, but it was amazing technology because this is happening under the control of Guangzhou. And I guess there's no difference between that and Africa. So if a student, and there are many, many students here doing bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and in fact, Mubarak was a master's student in Beijing as well. That was how we met in the first place, which is why I'm friends with him. He did exactly that. He came here for training, and then he went back to Uganda, and he implemented his training there.
Right.
So it's working well.
Yeah, and also there's a technological transfer, like the hybrid rice is a great achievement in Africa now, because in some areas in Rwanda where it was used, the hybrid rice, developed by the late Yuan Longping, the doctor, the Chinese doctor. It increases the productivity of each hectare by 7 times.
Yeah.
I followed a program by the Beijing Agricultural University. I also interviewed the person in charge of it in Tanzania. They had new techniques for production of corn, maize, in the country, in the area. And these are small projects, but these are very, very important pilot projects to prove that the technology works. And this could be generalized in the rest of Africa. So this is very, very important part of the cooperation.
One little snippet of information: Yuan Longping has a granddaughter who has just entered Guangdong Agricultural College.
Okay, that's good.
As a freshman. So I think she's like 18, 19 years old, and she's following grandfather's footsteps. That was something that I don't think many people would get to hear about in the West. I wanted to ask you about Sweden. Why is Sweden so actively involved? Belt and Road. You're part of the Schiller Institute, which I understand is German in its German American. But why is Sweden so active? Because aren't the Americans? Someone made a comment that Americans have a lot of bases in Sweden. What's going on there?
Yeah, that's a new phenomenon, because we just signed a military cooperation agreement with the United States after Sweden became a member of NATO, which is a paradigm shift in Swedish politics. For 200 years, we have been a neutral nation and stayed out of wars and trouble, and that contributed a lot to not only peace but also the economic development of our society here in Sweden. So. The thing is that Sweden is the Belt and Road support is not an institutional support. We created the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden because there's a lot of opposition to the Belt and Road in the formal political think tank and media sector. So we wanted to counterbalance that with objective information about the Belt and Road, about China's development, and also how Sweden and Swedish companies can actually benefit from working with China on the Belt and Road. And we know very well, from interactions with Swedish businesses, companies, and even researchers, that the cooperation with China is very, very important for them. Not only China is a big market, but also scientific research is a very important part of that. And therefore, they are keen on keeping that. But because of political pressure on Sweden from the United States, from Britain, from other, to reduce that cooperation is creating obstacles for that. So this is one of the reasons we actually wanted to start the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden.
You call it BRIX, which I think is a wonderful name because, of course, it sounds like bricks. Is that just Belt and Road Initiative Exchange, or what's
no, its original name was because, when we started, we had also entrepreneurs and business people. And somebody suggested we call it the Belt and Road Initiative Executive Group, which means, we want to implement the Belt and Road. So the executive X comes from executive group. But by time, we thought it is, we cannot do both think tank work and business at the same time. This will create division. So the people who do business, they are part of the China-Sweden Business Council.
Right.
I'm a member there too, but we separated. So the Belt and Road Institute, we changed the name, only deals with research on the Belt and Road as a think tank, not as a business initiative. But we kept the logo and the name, the bricks as a...
It's a wonderful name. I like it very much. Is Sweden a signatory to the Memorandum of Understanding for BRI?
No, Sweden is not. But fortunately, we actually lobbied for Sweden to enter the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And Sweden did it in the last day of the deadline. So we actually have one of the Swedish experts. He's the senior advisor, senior economist of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is very, very good because, we do have potential here. And it's important to have a foot in the door, so to speak, with China and with the other nations in the global south. And
very true.
So this is very important for us.
I think a lot of people wouldn't understand what the Asian Development Bank is. It was pretty much created to fund, I think, the Belt and Road Initiative. So where countries wanted to sign up to the Belt and Road but didn't have the resources to do anything with it, the Asian Development Bank would come in and do things differently.
There's a difference between the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Asian Development Bank.
Right, okay.
They're not the same. The AIIB is more connected to the Belt and Road, but not strictly. But many of the nations in the Belt and Road can get loans for infrastructure. It's very, very focused on infrastructure.
Right.
The Asian Development Bank is some sort of like a World Bank. It's not really Asian. It's like Japan is there, but it's the United States and Britain and European countries who contribute to it, and they dictate the policy of Asian Development Bank.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Which has its political conditionalities attached to it. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, where China is the largest shareholder, which is based in China, in Shanghai, does not have these political strings attached. Right. Nations who have capital in the bank, they can apply for financing, low interest financing for infrastructure projects. And on their website, you can actually see all the projects being financed by which is great. It's like $100 billion capital. This is important.
Okay. So there are probably two people in the world that I would refer to if someone says, what about China's debt traps? One of them is Deborah Brodegum. And she's written a book, she's written Harvard reviews, and she's basically debunked the myth. And you're the other one. You seem to know more about this than any other person I know. I don't even know if you know more than Deborah Brodegum, but at least as much as her. So tell us just very briefly how to debunk that, because everybody who's watching here is obviously pro-China. Nobody watches my channel who's anti-China. If they do, they've usually put a couple of comments on that and I've removed them. But tell us a little bit about how can we debunk this? What's the best way?
Yeah, well, I think it's important, of course, to have a knowledge. I mean, I really respect the work of Dr. Deborah Brautigam. I actually, writing this, I read her book on the agriculture. Will Africa feed the China? Because there was a story pushed out in 2009, 2010 during the global food crisis that China is taking over, is land grabbing in Africa to produce food for. As she traveled around Africa to the countries where people said China is taking land, and she discovered there is no truth to that.
Never is.
And I also refer in the book to an article in The Guardian, which said 1 million Chinese farmers are active in Africa. And then they refer to a United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization program report as a reference. So I clicked on it. Most readers don't click on the source. They say, I read the report. There was nothing about China. Nothing. Let alone 1 million Chinese farmers. And I said, I must have missed something. I read it again. I did a word search. I couldn't find anything in that report that suggests that China is taking land in Africa. What I discovered from studying other things is that actually British companies, followed by Scandinavian companies and other South American companies, they are taking huge chunks of land in East and West Africa to produce sugar and other oils for ethanol for cars in Europe.
Oh, right.
And there was a big scandal in Sweden.
The same thing was true of Australia.
Yes.
The Australian media went ballistic with this. China is buying up all of our land. China had bought less than 2% of the foreign-owned land. 2% of not the land, the foreign-owned land. 2% of that. 98% of the foreign-owned land was owned by other people. China had 2% of it. And yet the headline said, China doubles its land grab. China doubles its land in Australia. Well, it hadn't actually. What they'd done is they'd added Hong Kong to the mainland, which are separate entities, but they are one country, two systems. But they'd added Hong Kong to the mainland. And then China had bought some very large tract of land, which is basically a lot of this land is pretty useless. You have one cow for 3 acres or one sheep for 3 acres. And that's why you need very large tracts of land. And that on its own doubled the size of the land, but the value of it was virtually nothing.
No, the reality was that the Chinese they were first interested to invest in agriculture in Africa, but they went to Africa at the time, at the early 2000s. They found there's no irrigation infrastructure, there are no road infrastructure, there are no skilled farmers. So how can you grow food? So they withdrew. Actually, they didn't want to invest in agriculture in Africa as commercial thing. But what the Europeans did, Sweden did. I mean, there was a big scandal in Sweden. They took land from farmers, promising them work in an ethanol factory in the same area. But they lost their land and they didn't get the jobs. And it was a big scandal here in Sweden. It was supported by aid. But anyway, what I realized is that when you hear these stories pushed out against China and other countries, I come from Iraq, where, remember the weapons of mass destruction? That millions of people died because of that lie. So I learned to verify everything I hear and I say. When the death trap thing surfaced in 2018, some people say it comes from India. It's not true. The death trap as a term was already used in the 70s.
By China.
Yeah, not against China. It was about how the West, remember the book on the diaries of an economic assassin, a former CIA guy who worked for the World Bank as an advisor, and he explains how they trapped nations. This is back to the 70s.
I remember
the Indians, they brought it back in light because they were jealous of China in Sri Lanka. But the real report, which was spread all over the world, was something which was commissioned by the US State Department with 2 students in Harvard University. They were studying there, but one of them comes from the Defense Department. She was employed there. The other guy was from the Homeland Security Department. So they were commissioned by the State Department to write a report about the threat of China loaning money, especially for ports. They call the blue water projects. So they said, they looked at Hambantota in Sri Lanka, and they built a whole narrative about trade. So I looked at Sri Lanka's debt. I actually got the help from Dr. Brautigam, her study about that. She studied thousands of documents to show actually what China did is they bailed out Sri Lanka.
Yes. Yeah.
They actually helped Sri Lanka pay its debt in 2017 to Western bondholders. It was not China's choice to take the port, but the Sri Lankans, they offered the port to anybody. Nobody wanted to take it. The Chinese took it. They wanted to help the Sri Lankans. I looked at the Pakistan debt, and what I discovered is that exactly with the agricultural land is actually it's the West which is the culprit, not China. Mm-hmm. China is the solution. In the case of Pakistan, Pakistan was borrowing every year around $14 billion to buy natural gas and oil for electricity. But they were sitting on large rivers and piles of coal, but they cannot produce electricity. So their deficit comes from borrowing money in Britain and elsewhere to buy oil and gas from the Gulf countries. So that's the source of Pakistan's debt, actually, not China. I looked at the Chinese investments in Pakistan, mostly to solve the electricity problem. All of them are Chinese investments. The Chinese companies pay for the projects, but then they sell the electricity to get back their money over 25 years. So by looking at this case after case, I got trained myself into understanding the debt. I'm looking now at the sheet I've discovered of the Kenyan debt. It's a very good anatomical discussion, but I can show you. But I developed a method of when you look at the country's debt, first of all, you don't go to the media. You don't go to the experts from that country because everybody's prejudiced. I go to the central bank on the finance ministry's website and find their sheet. There's a sheet. It's often 2 pages, 3 pages. It tells you the whole story. Who owns the debt?
Right.
What is the percentage of China owning the debt? In Sri Lanka, I discovered it was only 10% of Sri Lanka's debt. Pakistan, it was 10%. Zambia, it's 17%. The rest is owned by Western, either multilateral institutions, World Bank, IMF, and private. The private ones are the worst because these are bondholders and they loan you money. These are loan sharks. They loan you money on very short term, very high interest. This is the source of Sri Lanka's problems. So you say, how much the share of why the country is in debt? You have to study the financial, economic conditions of the country. I studied Sri Lanka deeply. I went back 5 to 7 years back to study the development because Sri Lanka was totally dependent on tourism and on textile industry where they import both the garment and the machines. So they only provide the labor force. It doesn't make money really. But Sri Lanka was hit by 2 problems which destroyed their tourism industry. One was the terrorist attacks on the Easter Sunday, 2017, and then the COVID-19. So that was it for the Sri Lankan economy. Has nothing to do with China. So the allocation of the debt, how much China owns of the debt, this is number 1. The source of the problem of the debt. And 3, the quality difference. This is very important. When you say China has 10% of Sri Lanka, but what is the quality of that? Where that money is used?
Right.
Where that money is used. China's loans are used to build infrastructure, which improves the productivity of society, which allows it to pay back its debt. The other debt incurred from the Western bondholders usually loaned in times of crisis. Like Pakistan today, I posted some things on Pakistan. They got in trouble. They got in trouble now with the IMF because on an emergency basis, they go and borrow money with very harsh conditionalities, which hamper their economic development. So the quality difference in the Chinese loans to those countries and the Western loans to those countries must be studied. Does these loans improve the productivity of that society or it hampers it? So there you have these 3 principles every time I look at when I look at every country. So I do deep dives. I look back at the books of these guys. I mean, Sri Lanka, I look back at their national income, where it comes from, for 5 years. I spent a whole month, reading boring documents, but it was very valuable. Dr. Brautigam does the same, but Dr. Brautigam looks at things more as a bookkeeper. She's a very good bookkeeper. She can tell you all the numbers, but she does not look at this qualitative difference. That's one thing which I criticize in her work. And but she has enormous knowledge and resources she's doing a great job.
Good. So look at the debt. There's another great factor that needs to be taken into consideration, and that is that China may be managing this port on a 99-year lease, but the port can never be taken away from Sri Lanka. It still remains in Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka still actually has that port.
Yes. By the way, the idea to build the port does not come from China. It was actually a Canadian and a Danish consulting company financed by the Canadian aid organization because they wanted to help Sri Lanka after the Civil War. So this was one of the studies. Actually, the consulting company said this is a very promising project. Both the Canadian and Danish consulting companies said, invest in that. This is very good. But nobody wanted to invest in it. Nobody wanted to build it until the Chinese came. And now the Hambantota port actually is growing because it's very, very strategically located. But people forget about the enormous development of the Colombo port, which China is doing. That's a game changer in the whole Indian Ocean.
Well, I'm going to have a look at that soon. My wife and I have just booked flights to Colombo on the 16th of next month. So we're going to have a 2-week holiday in Sri Lanka and contribute something to their economy from China. That's our gift to Sri Lanka. So one last question for you, because we said about an hour and we just tipped over the hour. What about aid to Africa? We'll go back to Africa here. Is aid a positive or a negative thing?
I think from the experience we have seen, it's a negative thing because as I said, as you mentioned, that it tries to deal with the symptoms of a problem, but also it's very, very small scale. Africa is 3 times larger than China. The population is as large as China. It will double almost by 2050. So the what is needed as investment is enormous. And the aid projects, they usually go to very tiny projects like building a small clinic somewhere, building these water. I mean, water is a big issue in Africa. Millions of kids die every year because of polluted water. I mean, people don't think about it. Millions, literally. But you cannot make one project here and one project there. You drill a well and you put some chlorine in it, and that's it. It doesn't help. Look, Africa, 620 million Africans don't have access to electricity. The rest have limited access to electricity. Now, if you want to have a modern society, if you want to have a well-being of a people, you need to deal with that. And the way you deal with that is on large scale. We know that in the United States, in Europe, in China, you have to build large-scale infrastructure, dams, coal plants, nuclear plants, oil and gas. You have to use the whole arsenal you have. And I have disagreements with people who say, oh, let's think about the climate. Look, Africa is 17% of the world population, but their contributions to CO2 emissions is only 3.9%.
Right.
China is 23%. The United States is 19%. So all of continent of Africa, they don't, even if we agree on this question of climate change, the electricity consumption in Africa is 100 kilowatts per hour per capita, 180. This is 2 light bulbs. In China, in the United States, it's 13,000 per capita. 13,000. In Europe, it's 6,800. In China, it's 4,000. So 180 compared to 13,000 or 6,000. This is enormous. So we need to focus, as we put a number of projects here, the Grand Inga Dam, that can produce 100,000 megawatts of power, the whole Congo River. But the Grand Inga Dam can produce 40,000 megawatts of power. That's twice as much as the Three Gorges Dam in China. So we need to, we discussed here, we need to use all the oil and gas potential existing in Africa. We need to use the coal in Africa, at least temporarily, to bring Africa to a higher living standard.
Yep.
And then go to nuclear power. I think we are strong supporters of nuclear power. So it is not, to ask Africans to think about the climate, to decarbonization. It's both irresponsible and immoral today, actually, to ask Africans not to industrialize, not to use their natural resources for development, because what Africa needs is enormous. The potential is great, it's there, and Africa can create, have rapid development like China did. But China now, because you had enormous pollution, you had enormous problem, but now China is solving that problem because China has the economic capability, technological capability to do that. But you cannot ask a nation to do that which does not have the capability, does not have the technology and know-how to do these things. But Africa deserves the right to become productive, use its natural resources, all of them, the whole mix, and rapidly industrialize and develop. But at the same time, of course, think about the environment, other things. But to put that as a precondition, that is not, I don't accept that myself.
Okay. So
therefore, you cannot build the Inga Dam with aid money. It requires $30 billion. You need a whole bank structure to do that.
Right.
Or building high-speed railway all over Africa.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we need
you can do overnight, is it?
Yeah.
Sorry.
There is one thing which we can discuss another time, is that how that will be financed. It's a very important point. All these mega projects we are talking about here, all over Africa, how will it be financed? This is very, very important discussion, but we cannot take it right now.
Yeah, we haven't got all night. You're actually the one of the very few people I've heard who contradicted Xi Jinping. And he said we need to do many small, beautiful projects. And you said, no, we need big projects.
Yeah, I didn't contradict him. You see, he said the same thing in the third Belt and Road Forum in 2022, which I attended. He says this is a supplement. This is in addition. In addition to, now look at the discussion, the $50 billion Xi Jinping discussed is going to infrastructure mostly. They just signed an agreement with Zambia and Tanzania to develop the railway, which is 1,800 kilometer railway project. Mm-hmm. So President Xi means, that we need also to have projects which affect the lives of people in the immediate situation. Now, this is, it's good for propaganda. It's good, it's good for some people to feel the effect of the investment. It's good. I mentioned a lot of agricultural projects, which touches the lives and livelihood of people immediately, because a railway project, a power plant, a dam, it takes many years for people to feel the impact of it. But it's necessary. It's necessary.
Someone has just put up a question here, which you may know the answer to, but I certainly do not. When or will, I think probably will is a better way to start, China and Russia intervene in the dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia because it's heading towards an armed conflict. Do you know anything about that? It's not my.
Yes, of course. I before writing the book, I wrote a series of 4 articles, long articles about the development of the Nile Basin. That's the whole Nile Basin, from the Great Lakes all the way to Alexandria in Egypt, and I took up that in one of the parts of the Ethiopian, and because my take on this is that African nations should use the full potential of the hydropower of their countries, of the rivers in Africa, and that includes the Blue Nile. The problem between Egypt and Ethiopia is not that Ethiopia wants to take the water, because where the dam is being built is right on the border with Sudan, and it's not agricultural land. There's no population there, but it's perfect for building a hydropower plant.
Right.
So there's no threat to the water coming to Egypt, because in Egypt, this is a life and death issue since thousands of years. The water from the Nile is the life and death issue for Egyptian people, and that's important to understand. But the threat was not to that there will be water coming to Egypt or not. Ethiopia cannot keep the water. The big dispute was on how quickly Ethiopia will fill the dam, because they will have to withhold some of the water.
Of course.
And there was a lot of political games played around, but there's basically no threat to the water. Actually, it helps Sudan deal with the enormous flooding that takes place every year and kills thousands of people, because I write in my articles that the Blue Nile is very erratic river, because all the water flows, all the rain on the Ethiopian plateau falls between August and October.
Right.
It's like 3 months where you have enormous amount of water falling. And usually that results in flooding in Sudan. And also the dams in Sudan are threatened because of the silt coming from the Ethiopian rivers. So this is actually a secret. Sudan paid money to Ethiopia for the investment after the World Bank, the EU, and the United States abandoned the financing of the project. Sudan and, of course, Kenya and Djibouti actually contributed to the financing of the dam because they would get electricity out of it. 6,000 megawatts, that's a lot. It's going to be now the largest hydropower plant in all of Africa. So many African nations will benefit from that. So I discussed with Egyptian experts, many of them, they know there is no physical problem, but it's a political problem. So it's good if Russia and China can intervene, but I don't think there is a reason they need to intervene, just that Ethiopia and Egypt get along.
Yeah, if there's going to be an armed conflict, then it's time to intervene. So some closing words. How is the future looking for the Belt and Road Initiative?
I think the Belt and Road Initiative is going to grow more. It will change in nature, as I said, more into industrial development, technological development, transfer of technology. For example, China is moving into, like in Africa, there are many industrial parks being built. So African companies are building industries for production mostly of consumer goods, clothing, textiles, shoe wear, but also electronics closer to the markets.
Right.
Also where the labor is cheaper, but it's closer to the markets, like in Egypt and Ethiopia. Now, your friend also mentions the industrial park in Mbale. In Uganda, I was surprised when I saw it, because some of my friends here in Sweden, they come from Mbale. And they tell me Mbale is a small village, it's just out of nowhere. It's in the middle of nowhere. But Mbale now has one of the large industrial parks where people produce electronics. It's like, so it is very interesting. So this is the new shape of the new feature of the Belt and Road, is that the fruits of industrialization and modernization in China will be spread all over the 3 continents. And as I said, the policy is to make China's partners better, customers, because, Europe and the United States are closing down, and therefore there will be new markets for Chinese products, but these markets have to grow. And China is contributing with its relocating industrial capacity and technological capacity into these regions. So this is the new feature of the Belt and Road.
Okay, thank you. It's been an incredibly interesting conversation, and we got up to almost 300 viewers, which is quite a lot for me. I'm very, very pleased about that. So, Hussein Askari, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thanks for everything you've told us about the Belt and Road and your experiences with Africa, Sweden, Iraq, everything else. It's been a really good conversation, and thank you for the people who've been involved in the comment section as well. So we'll call it a night there, because here it's afternoon.